Welcome back to Stroke of Luck. My name is Tack, and today we're going to make Mephiston look like a god. Starting with a zenithal prime, I used the airbrush with some scarlet red to lay down a nice base coat over everything that's going to be red. If you're new to airbrushing, a pro tip is you want to keep the airbrush moving and just gently feather the trigger. When you're painting miniatures, it's easy to overdo it with an airbrush. Next, from a downward angle, I sprayed a 2-to-1 mix of scarlet red and bloody red to act as a first highlight. Again, taking my time and carefully feathering the trigger and keeping the airbrush moving. After that, I blocked out the small details and gloves in black, and once that had all dried, it was time to start with our first highlights on the chest piece. I went in with a mix of scarlet red, bloody red, pale flesh, and sun yellow, being a bit heavy on the pale flesh. I had this mix thinned down quite a bit and I applied several thin layers until it was just right, and I made sure to just apply a little bit of paint and just drag the paint with my brush. Again, being very careful so that way I keep the dark recesses. Once that had dried, using some very thin down bloody red, I began glazing some highlights on the cloak. These layers are going to be very thin, so it's almost to the point where they're not even noticeable, but we're just building it up before we start adding some brighter colors. Whenever you're glazing, it's always a bit of a back and forth. If it looks bad, you probably haven't added enough layers. Another key to glazing is you want to pull the paint toward the color that you're using to build up those nice gradients. So essentially what I'm doing here is I'm using that highlight mix and I'm going back and forth between that and thin down bloody red, and I'm just slowly adding thin layers until I build up the highlights. Next, I added some ivory to the highlight mix and I began glazing just the sharpest edges. You really want the cloak to pop since it's one of the major focal points on the model. Then it was just a bit more back and forth with the bloody red until the blend was nice and smooth. Once that was all dry, I mixed up a lovely gray using black and ivory, and I applied it as a highlight to all of the wings, the gloves, and the skulls, and then I layered this color pretty heavily over the tubes. Next, I mixed up a wash using Flow Improver, ultramarine blue, bloody red, and black. And then I just went in shading all of the recesses in the robes, and I touched the deeper areas of the chest armor. I also used this to tone down the gray on the gloves, and then I applied it pretty heavily on the tubes. It was starting to come together, and next it was time for me to space out while staring at the model before I went in with some ivory off camera for the wings and the skulls. Then I used Bag of Bones Express color on the skulls. Once that dried, I hit a lot of the recesses on the armor and the wings with a wash made from Flow Improver in black. And for the cloak, I just went in with straight black. Now it was time for the metallics. For the silvery bits, I used metallic medium and black. I mixed it to where it looked a bit like lead belcher. For the gold, I used Retributor armor. This was my first time using this paint, and honestly I see why some people complain about it, but I don't know, I kind of like it. I did all the blood gems and vials using Scarlet Red, Bloody Red, and then off camera I used our highlight mix from the chest piece and some dead white to highlight them. Next, using the same wash mix from earlier, I hit all the metallic bits, and I tried my best to control the pooling so it didn't look splotchy, and the Flow Improver is the secret. That stuff helps tremendously, and you can pretty much just use it to make a wash with any color. It's really a game changer. I highly recommend you get some Flow Improver, even if you don't have an airbrush. Next, with some metallic medium, I began adding edge highlights on all the silvery bits. And then for the sword, with a sharp dry brush, I added scratches with some quick flicks of the wrist. I also added some chunky highlights to the necklace. Next, using some succubus skin and just a whisper of ultramarine blue, I added a base layer on the face. Now, I'm just warning you guys, I'm not good at faces, but I'm definitely going to do my best here. Next, I added some Athena skin to the base mix, and I began adding some highlights. These are going to be a bit thicker highlights. After that, I added a healthy amount of pale flesh to the mix for another round of highlights. I began adding some very thin glaze layers, just slowly taking my time because I suck at faces, and I really wanted to do Mephiston justice. I then added ivory to the mix for just the sharpest points on the face. Next, I picked out the teeth with some ivory. Then I used some Athena skin for the tongue. Off camera, I accidentally flooded the eyes with white ink. Next, I went back to my middle highlight mix and glazed some layers just to smooth everything out and add a little bit more shading. It was a real back and forth glazing the different face tones. I hate painting faces. For the hair, I added a base coat of leather brown, which is kind of a dark mustardy color. I felt like it was going to be a fitting base tone. Ice yellow is the next color, and I use this to catch all the edges on the hair. Next, using some ivory, I began adding some highlights to the sharpest edges, and I just started trying to add some thin lines to add some texture. For the eyes and the metallic bits on his temples, I glazed a thin layer of Hydra turquoise. Once that was dry, it was time to move on to the plasma pistol. I started by adding some very thinned down white ink, both with a brush, and then I added a halo with the airbrush. Still using the airbrush, I added some hydro turquoise, and then I added just a whisper of gauze green. I feel like the gauze green really just added that extra oomph. Then with a mix of white ink and flow improver, I went back into the recesses at the bottom just to make it look extra bright before going back in with our hydro turquoise on just the edges of the coils. And I also touched the vents. Next, using a thinned down black, I began doing some freehand on the robes. I've never attempted any freehanding like this, but I think it turned out pretty good. Next, I highlighted the cloak with our gray mix. On the base, I dabbed some hydro turquoise, and then with some very thin white ink. You'll see why later. I used Pro Acryl Gold for the trim on the cloak, and again, this is my first time trying any freehanding like this, but I don't think it turned out too bad. For the base, I added a Grelin Earth, and I thinned down white ink over the spot that we had painted earlier, making sure it got into the recesses. The rest of the base just got a black wash. For the sword, I used dead white to sketch out some lightning patterns. And once it had dried, I glazed over it with some hydro turquoise. Next, I went back in with dead white to highlight the lightning. Next, over the entirety of the base, I dry brushed our gray mix. Then I added a bit of white to the mix for the edges. After that, I added some wasteland tufts so he matches my army. And then I began bending some jewelry wire into little lightning bolts. I also made some tiny cork rocks, and I stuck the lightning bolts through the cork with some glue. The goal here is to glue these to the base so it looks like Mephiston is breaking the ground around him with some kind of warp energy. With the airbrush, I added some white ink where the lightning touches, and then I began airbrushing some very thin down fluorescent blue. The fluorescent blue was very thin already, and I don't think I would have added as much thinner as I did, so just be careful if you're going to try it out. Using dead white, I painted the lightning bolts, and then I thinned it down very heavily with flow improver, and I went into the recesses around the crackled base. Then I added just a few spots of gauze green, and it was ready for the reveal. Let me know in the comments what you think of this Mephiston. I'm very happy with how this model turned out. I was extremely scared to paint him. I was super intimidated. I don't really know why. I think it's just because he's a named character, and I mean, the lore behind him is just insane, you know? So it's like, I really didn't want to f it up. The floating rocks are just too cool for me. I absolutely love it. Sorry it took me so long to post another video. My computer has just been on its last leg, and editing these videos is like getting into a fist fight with a gorilla. So I appreciate all the support. You guys are incredible. Be sure to add me on Instagram and Facebook. I'll probably be posting on there a little bit more. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe. And again, as always, thank you for watching.